Good afternoon. I'm Mark Nelson, professor of philosophy here at Westmont and director of the Dallas Willard Research Center. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, who is Dr. Todd Hall. Dr. Hall is a clinical psychologist and professor at Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola. He has a BA in psychology from Biola, 2 MAs, one from Biola, one from UCLA, and a PhD in psychology, also from Rosemead. He's authored 3 books and dozens of peer-reviewed articles or book chapters in leading journals such as the Journal of Psychology and Religion, International Journal for Psychology and Religion, Journal of Psychology and Theology, and on. He is nationally recognized for his research on spiritual development, leadership and organization, and human flourishing. He's also the recipient of the 2022 Dallas Willard Research Center Book Award. And to explain this, I need to take a little detour. As many of you know, Dallas Willard was a Christian philosopher, pastor, and author of books such as The Spirit of the Disciplines and Renovation of the Heart. These books are now regarded as modern spiritual classics, and they've inspired thousands of Christians from every walk of life and every branch of the church to become apprentices to Jesus. Supported by the Martin Institute for Christianity and Culture, the Dallas Willard Research Center is working to place an enduring emphasis on the intellectual legacy of Dallas Willard, including his focus on the possibility and path to authentic spiritual and moral transformation. Dallas passed away in 2013, but his influence continues to grow, and we are pleased to have members of his family here with us this afternoon. We're grateful for their friendship and encouragement, and also grateful for the support of Patty and F. Martin, whose generosity have made this award possible. The Book Award program was created in 2015 to recognize and encourage original, written, exemplary scholarship. I didn't originally write this, I'm just reading what was written here. That reflects the intellectual commitments that characterize Dallas Willard's work throughout his career. Those commitments are: 1, robust metaphysical realism; 2, epistemological realism; 3, the development of comprehensive, integrative models of the human person; and 4, the development of objective measurement for different Christian formative practices that in principle can place these practices in the domain of publicly accessible knowledge. Now that's philosophy talk. Translated into plain English, it means something like this: things are real and we can know them. People are real too, and they have bodies, minds, souls, and wills. And we should study people in ways that do justice to these facts and that show how and whether Christian spiritual practices really do work. And this is where our speaker comes back in. With his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Lewis Hall, who's also a professor of psychology at Rosemead, Professor Todd Hall wrote a book that does those things. Their book, Relational Spirituality, weaves together psychology, neurobiology, and theology to show us what spiritual transformation is, how it happens, and what sorts of communities can foster it. Their book was selected by an independent panel of judges, nothing to do with me. So I'm just saying that it's not just me being nice to them. Their book was selected by an independent panel of judges out of a large field of other really strong books on these topics as the book award winner for this past year. So we have asked Professor Hall to come and give us a taste of some of their findings. I anticipate he'll speak for somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 3 hours, and that we will have time for Q&A with the audience afterward. For now, please join me in congratulating and welcoming the Dallas Willard Research Center Book Award winner, Dr. Todd Hall.
Thank you. It is great to be with you today. Liz and I are very grateful for the invitation to spend some time in your community today and to reflect on this topic of relational spirituality. We've really enjoyed our time here and have some great connections with Steve Porter, who I think is somewhere. Maybe he ditched us already, but who came recently. There he is, Steve. And we're getting to know some wonderful friends here today as well. And it is definitely a distinct honor to receive the 2022 Book Award from the Dallas Willard Research Center here at the Martin Institute. Any award with the name Dallas Willard on it is definitely an honor. We're deeply appreciative of the work the Martin Institute is doing to promote scholarship and practice in this very critical area of spiritual formation, which was clearly at the heart of Dallas Willard's work and legacy. So I want to start today by sharing a little bit of my story that illustrates the struggles that many people are experiencing today. And my story is ultimately what led me to write the book, Relational Spirituality. So it's the backstory behind the book, in a sense. So as far back as I can remember, my mom struggled with very significant mental health issues. And when I was quite young, about 9 years old, she left the family. And all of this contributed to a sense of disconnection with family, with friends, and even within myself. I developed ways to protect myself from this pain, but they always backfired in the end and led to more of a sense of emptiness and less authentic relationships. And this feeling of being alone and disconnected also seeped into my relationship with God. Up through my college years, I often felt very distant from God. And I later realized that this pain and disconnection in my relationship with God was linked to these formative childhood experiences. And I think my story is a reflection of our collective story of relational and spiritual disconnection and the search for meaning in a fragmented, lonely, post-COVID world. And I'm not sure if it's post, but you know what I'm saying. Many people feel this uneasy disconnection because the family unit and communities that teach us how to connect to people and to God have been steadily weakening for the past 50 years or so. We are living in the midst of a connection crisis. So how then do you cultivate connection and spiritual formation in the midst of increasing social isolation, loneliness, and fragmentation? The short answer is that we are loved into loving. In recent decades, a new relational spirituality paradigm has emerged from multiple fields, including Trinitarian theology, attachment theory, relational psychoanalysis, infant research, emotion theory, and affective neuroscience, to name just a few. There is now a critical mass of evidence that human beings are fundamentally relational, that we heal and grow primarily and directly through relationships with God and others, ultimately in the context of the church, the new family of God. This is the central idea of a relational spirituality paradigm. And this morning I want to focus on a few key themes around this central idea, with a particular focus on implicit relational knowledge and how this plays out in our attachment to God and others and in the process of deep growth. So here are the four major themes I want to focus on today. After briefly touching on the connection crisis that I mentioned, I want to set the frame for a relational paradigm for spiritual formation, and then talk about attachment filters, and then the process of deep growth. So let's dive into this challenge we're facing, the connection crisis. It's no secret that there's an enormous amount of stress going on in the world that is negatively impacting Christians and non-Christians alike all over the world. We've had a pandemic, there's a war going on, social unrest, and unprecedented uncertainty and change in our organizations. This has amplified an existing trend of rising mental health issues. Research is showing an overall decline in mental health since the pandemic, at least in the US, and the statistics are probably similar worldwide. Based on their results of their 2020 Stress in America report, the American Psychological Association stated, "We are facing a national mental health crisis that could yield serious health and social consequences for years to come." While external stressors going on in the world are certainly contributing to the rising mental health issues, I want to suggest this morning that the root cause is social disconnection. Many of the general mental health issues we're seeing are signs and symptoms of social disconnection. Psychologist Diana Fosha contends that mental health problems ultimately stem from feeling alone in the midst of unbearable emotional pain. There is a large research base documenting the rise of social disconnection, which shows up in numerous ways, including a decline in social capital, defined by Robert Putnam in his landmark book, Bowling Alone, as social networks comprised of reciprocity and trustworthiness. Also, a decline in closeness with family, friends, and community. And a decline in the number of confidants that people have. So people that you can talk with about important issues in your life. The most common number of confidants has decreased from 3 in 1985 to 0 in 2004. So think about that. The average person out there has no one with whom to talk about important issues in their life. That is a disturbing trend. We also see this trend in the increase in loneliness, which has doubled since the 1980s. In a 2017 Harvard Business Review article, Vivek Murthy, the former U.S. Surgeon General, stated loneliness is a growing health epidemic. So what does all this have to do with our spiritual lives? It turns out there's a strong link between social and spiritual disconnection. Social disconnection has a profound impact on our experience of God and spiritual community. The connection crisis in our society has led to a parallel spiritual connection crisis. So why does this happen? When I was young, I quickly developed strategies to avoid my emotional pain and to secure some kind of pseudo-connection with the important people in my life. And we all do this. We all develop strategies, albeit mostly subconsciously, to cope with the emotional pain of disconnection and to maintain a pseudo-connection with the important people in our lives. For example, we might become overly self-reliant so as to not bother others, or we might become a people pleaser, or an entertainer, or an achiever to earn people's love. These strategies, or defense mechanisms, as we call them in psychology, inevitably backfire and hinder the very connection that we most want and need. This happens because these strategies require us to sacrifice something that is necessary for healthy relationships, and that's connection to ourselves. John Calvin emphasized that true wisdom requires knowing God and knowing ourselves. Because these defense mechanisms negatively impact our knowledge of self, they also hinder our knowledge of God and our spiritual growth. As believers, we often play out these strategies in the context of our spiritual life. They have the same defensive function and the same negative effects, causing us to feel spiritually empty and disconnected from God. So there's evidence that social and spiritual disconnection are on the rise. How do our models of spiritual growth factor into this? Another layer of this challenge is that within many sectors of the evangelical movement, there is a growing recognition that our conceptual models of spiritual transformation are truncated, and so they're not addressing these critical issues. A recent study on the current state of discipleship, for example, noted that in many churches, there is an assumption that the appropriation of biblical knowledge will by itself lead to spiritual maturity. This assumption gets to the heart of the problem that relational spirituality addresses, a rationalistic paradigm of knowing God, ourselves, and others. And this is part of my story. After my parents split up, my mom left the family, and I became a Christian shortly after that. But there was a lot of pain beneath the surface. There were times I focused a lot of my energy on gaining knowledge about God and about the Bible, the intellectual approach to spiritual growth. And I believed somewhere deep in my heart that if I just knew enough about God and theology and Scripture, that then I would find meaning and all this pain from my family would go away. And this worked for a while, but over time, it stopped working and it fell apart because the knowledge was only up here and I didn't feel God's presence. Focusing on ideas about God kept my pain away in the short run, but at the cost of connection with God. This rationalistic approach to Scripture and God has long-standing historical roots, and it has caused some segments of the evangelical movement to emphasize knowing about God at the expense of knowing God relationally. Part of the reason for that, I believe, is that focusing on relationship with God is a messy process that we can't control, and it requires dependence on God and surrender to God. In this vein, in his wonderful book, Life in the Trinity, Donald Fairbairn states, part of the reason there is a divorce between doctrine and Christian life is that contemporary evangelicals normally understand doctrines as concepts, teachings, true ideas, to which we often give the word propositions. And we unwittingly see these doctrines as the objects of our faith. I mentioned that early in my Christian life, the knowledge I had about God felt empty because I didn't feel God's presence. Toward the end of college, for the first time, but by no means the last, I came to the end of myself. My relationships were falling apart, and I realized that I needed help to heal and to grow. And so I turned to God. And God showed up. In a powerful moment, He was very present to me and affirmed that I needed help, and that He would be with me, and that He would bring people into my life to guide me. And that experience put me on a different path, a path of embracing a relational paradigm of spiritual growth, in which your spirituality empowers you to face your pain with the help of loving relationships and to grow in your love for God and neighbor. A relational paradigm is based on a theology of being in relation, which is a relational view of the image of God. Our Trinitarian God is intrinsically relational, the three persons of the Godhead living in perfect union, mutuality, and harmony with each other. A unity or interpenetration that's captured by the ancient Greek term perichoresis. So the proposal here is that the primary way that we reflect God or are like God is in our relational nature, that we are beings in relation. This model of being in relation has three organizing principles. The first is that human beings have a relational nature. The second is that the goal of sanctification is a relational goal that I refer to as loving presence, which is the result of being renewed in the image of Christ. And the third is that the process of sanctification is relational. We heal and grow primarily and directly through relationships with God and others. Again, ultimately in the context of the church, the new family of God. We are loved into loving. In short, a relational spirituality paradigm suggests that spiritual transformation is a relational process in which you become more loving by taking in more and more of Christ's love for you. When I was younger, it was difficult and scary for me to open up to others. And the reason is that I had a filter operating for close relationships that said something like this: if I open up to others, they will let me down and hurt me. This is what I expected to happen at a very deep gut level. This was the operation of my subconscious mind, if you will. And this caused me to become very self-sufficient until the walls I built came crashing down. So what are these filters, and how do they change? This is the second theme of the relational spirituality model that I want to touch on today: attachment filters, how relationships shape our capacity to love. There is strong scientific evidence that human beings are born to form attachment relationships, or that we are created to connect. Here's how Alan Shore, a neuropsychologist and leading thinker in this area, puts it. He says, the idea is that we are born to form attachments, that our brains are physically wired to develop in tandem with another's through emotional communication beginning before words are spoken. So what is an attachment relationship? An attachment relationship is a particular kind of relationship, a deep connection between a caregiver and someone on the receiving end of that, such as a child. When a child becomes attached to her parent, usually by 6 months of age, something happens inside each one of them and between the two of them. an invisible bond develops that is supported by a literal brain-to-brain link-up between the parent and the child. The way this invisible bond shows itself, attachment researchers tell us, is through three characteristics. First, infants seek to stay physically close to their attachment figures. And the flip side of that coin, they become distressed from their attachment figures when they're separated. Infants regulate connection by being physically close to their attachment figures. However, as we grow, emotional connection relies less on physical proximity and more on the memory of the felt presence of our attachment figures. Second, attachment figures provide, to varying degrees, what we can call a secure base. And there are two aspects to this: comfort during times of distress, and encouragement or challenge to explore the world, both internally and externally. In attachment theory, these are referred to as a haven of safety and a secure base, but they're really two sides of the same coin, so we can just refer to these as a secure base. Overall, when attachment figures are available, when needed, when they're attuned to the emotions of the child, comforting when they're distressed, and when they provide positive encouragement and challenge for the children to explore the world, then these attachment figures provide children a sense of felt security about themselves and their worlds. Our sense of felt security comes primarily from the specific people to whom we are attached. This is the big take-home point about secure attachment, that a secure base comprised of a combination of comfort and challenge or encouragement is what creates this felt sense of security, or an internal secure base for children and for adults. This gets internalized and forms an internal template for how relationships work for us, which then shapes how we experience and relate to others, including God. So we've talked about attachment in infancy. What about in adulthood? The attachment system operates throughout life, and so adults also form attachment relationships with others. However, as I mentioned, the overall way that emotional connection is sought, experienced, and communicated transitions from physical closeness in infancy to emotional intimacy or felt security in adulthood. There is now a very large research literature that clearly establishes that attachment affects nearly every aspect of development throughout the lifespan. For example, research shows a strong association between insecure attachment in infancy and behavior problems in preschool, neuroticism or general negative emotions, and a whole spectrum of specific mental disorders. In addition to the prototype of becoming attached to parents, we also become attached to spouses, partners, close friends, and to God. There's a large research literature on attachment to God, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first I want to note that we also become personally or symbolically attached to leaders and organizations. So those of you who are leaders, pastors involved in ministry of any kind, people will tend to become symbolically attached to you, if not personally, if there's not a direct personal relationship. And so that's important to understand. It can be very helpful in your relationship with the people that you serve. So let's return to this idea of attachment to God for just a minute. So Jake is a client, not his real name, but came to see me for therapy due to anxiety about his unstable relationship with his girlfriend. When he was young, Jake lost his mother, and his father showed very little empathy and didn't seem to be able to connect to his feelings of sadness and loss. And this led to an attachment tendency or filter that could be captured in a statement I once made to Jake when I said, "It sounds like you feel like eventually everyone will leave you." Jake also experienced a lot of anxiety in his relationship with God. He expected God to be inconsistently available, much like his father was. He would anxiously pray during a crisis, as if he had to be in a desperate situation to get God's attention. And then even if he experienced some temporary relief, he would then withdraw from God and church to protect himself from the pain of impending abandonment that he expected, again at a very deep gut level. Jake's ingrained patterns of relating and feeling shaped all his relationships, including his relationship with God. So this raises an interesting question. Does our attachment to God mirror our human attachment patterns? Or can we experience God as loving and secure despite painful or even traumatic experiences with human attachment figures? I think the answer to both questions is a qualified yes. Our attachment to God at a gut implicit level does tend to mirror our attachment patterns with human authority figures, even when it's painful. The reason is that our attachment to God is based, at least in part, on a deep implicit relational form of knowing that is crafted from our experiences with the human beings that we have depended on for life, protection, and emotional security. Jake's attachment to God was shaped in profound ways by his early upbringing. But our attachment to God can grow, heal, and change with new, loving relational experiences with others and with God. So, what do these attachment relationships look like? It turns out there are 4 broad patterns of attachment to which we now turn. These 4 basic patterns of attachment that have been identified in research are based on 2 underlying latent factors. And so you can see on the slide here, on the vertical dimension, we have relational engagement versus avoidance. And on the horizontal dimension, we have emotional distress on the left and emotional composure on the right. And so that is one dimension horizontally, and then vertically is one dimension. And so when we look at the way infants relate in an experimental paradigm called the strange situation, when we look at how adults tell their attachment story in an interview called the Adult Attachment Interview, as well as how people respond on self-report questionnaires about attachment, in all of those methods, these 2 latent dimensions emerge. And so when you put them together, you get these 4 quadrants and these different patterns of attachment. So research has demonstrated that these attachment patterns develop in early childhood, usually by 12 months of age, and they continue into adulthood. And that in and of itself is an amazing thing, right? That these are in place by 12 months of age based on emotional communication. Infants by 12 months of age have already learned what to expect from mom or dad or various attachment figures, and they respond based on that. What happens is that repeated experiences with caregivers get stored in an implicit gut-level form of memory that create an implicit template or mental model of how relationships work. And these templates operate outside of our conscious awareness and shape how we relate to others. So this is your subconscious mind at work. Your subconscious mind or implicit self comes to believe what it perceives about how important people feel toward you. In about 70% of cases, these patterns remain unchanged. But they can and do change with reflection, new relational behaviors, and new relational experiences. And each of these insecure types of attachment reflect different ways of protecting ourselves from emotional pain in unhealthy relationships or interactions, so that we can maintain some kind of connection, or pseudo-connection, if you will, because we are made for relationship. Some connection, even if it's painful, is better than no connection at all. And I believe that is a reflection of the image of God in us. These self-protective strategies, however, always have a cost. Whatever your ingrained patterns of connecting with others are, you will recreate that relational environment with the most important people in your life. So all of us need to be aware of our attachment patterns and be on a journey of growing in our capacities for secure-based connection. And we're not always operating in one quadrant, although most people do tend to have one dominant attachment pattern. But even if you're secure most of the time, our attachment tendencies get activated or triggered, especially when we're distressed or feel threatened. And so when that happens, you might find yourself moving to one of the other quadrants. And so that's a good time to pay attention when you feel distressed or threatened. Do you move toward withdrawing from others, which is the more dismissing kind of attachment? Or do you move toward becoming clingy and feeling helpless and demanding of others, more of a preoccupied, anxious type of attachment? So if we take a look at the chart, we'll unpack these briefly. We'll start in that top left quadrant. So I'm calling this anxious attachment. In the literature, it's called preoccupied attachment for adults. I mentioned Jake earlier, that his attachment tendency or filter could be captured by this statement I made to him, that eventually, it sounds like you feel like eventually everyone will leave you. And this is a version of what attachment researchers call preoccupied or anxious attachment, in which people like Jake, when they're operating in this tendency, become relationally engaged. They're pursuing others, but they're also emotionally distressed. And they have difficulty regulating their emotions. And so that's sometimes people like Jake cope with painful experiences by kicking their attachment system into high gear or hyperactivating it. And they become anxious and clingy. And you can see on the slide some of the characteristics. There's dysregulated vulnerability. So they're able to be vulnerable, but it's dysregulated. They can be emotionally clingy when they're operating in this pattern or state. They tend to be emotionally dysregulated. So they have trouble managing their emotions. They need other people to help them manage their emotions, and sometimes that drives people away. And that's part of what recreates the patterns. They also tend to lack confidence. They are overly reliant on others, so they tend to feel helpless. And they have an embedded stance toward their own experience, meaning they have difficulty stepping outside of their own experience and taking the perspective of other people and thinking about their experience. They tend to feel trapped in their experience, and that's part of what makes it difficult to get out of this. So then if we take a look in the bottom right, this is what's called dismissing attachment. So other people cope with painful experiences. And by the way, I should say that for the anxious attachment, what we think that in terms of the typical experience that leads to that, is inconsistent availability of the parents. So sometimes parents showed up emotionally, sometimes they didn't, and the child was not able to know for sure, and so they tend to become very anxious and preoccupied with the availability of their attachment figures. With dismissing, it's different. Other people cope by shutting down their attachment system or deactivating it, especially when they are distressed. They disengage and they avoid closeness, but they remain emotionally composed, at least on the surface. And so they tend to have a hard time, other people have a hard time feeling close to them. They tend to have lower emotional intelligence. They don't pick up on emotional cues as much. They struggle to convey empathy, and sometimes they go it alone, especially when they need help. So when they're distressed, that's when they most withdraw from people and from God, because they learned early on the important people in my life that I'm supposed to be able to depend on for care are not going to be there for me. They're consistently unavailable. And so they learn I have to deal with things on my own. I had a client one time, I'll call him Joe. One time he said to me, if there's one thing in the third person, if there's one thing Joe has learned, it's that Joe can only rely on Joe. That this was his style. He learned early on that his parents were not going to be there and that he had to figure things out for himself. And so you can see some of the characteristics there. There's low vulnerability. It's difficult for them to be vulnerable. They tend to be emotionally guarded, emotionally disengaged, overly self-reliant, right? So they withdraw from others and they become very self-reliant. And that works in some situations and settings to a point, but there are costs and drawbacks to that, right? Relationally and spiritually. There's a pseudo-confidence. So there's a confidence, but below the surface, there's a lot of pain that's not being dealt with, that's being shoved under the carpet. And there's a disconnected stance toward their experience. So they tend to not be as aware of their experience. So if we take a look now at the bottom left, this is what's called fearful attachment. And so this is an attachment tendency or pattern that tends to be associated with abuse or trauma, significant difficulties like that, in which you can see there's emotional distress and also avoidance. A client I'll call Jane exhibited a fearful attachment style, so she was relationally avoidant and emotionally distressed. with respect to attachment relationships. She had a history of severe trauma, and she would often dissociate. She was fearful of me at times and would often emotionally withdraw and sometimes sabotage our work together. She desired connection, but it was associated with the pain of abuse, which caused her to briefly reach out to others, but then she would quickly withdraw and avoid, even though she was distressed. So then if we look at the top right, we see secure attachment. So in contrast to Jake and Jane, others are fortunate to grow up in a safe relational environment and don't need to either hyperactivate or deactivate their attachment system. They develop a secure attachment early in life, and some people, of course, develop this later, which in the attachment theory is called earned secure attachment. It probably should be called transformed secure rather than earned, but that's the idea that it can change and transform. So Andrew was a young man that I interviewed for a research project, and he exhibited this. He grew up in a very secure environment with very secure, loving parents. He learned at an early age that he could trust his parents to be emotionally available, to comfort him when he was distressed. And as a result, he felt comfortable with his attachment needs. And he developed the ability to form close relationships with others and with God. He was comfortable with emotional intimacy. And when I asked him, have you ever experienced anxiety in your relationship with God? He said, no one in my life has really ever given me a reason to feel that, and so I don't expect that with God. I expect God will be there for me, and he has been. So that security from his parents transferred to his relationship with God. So this is this quote from David Benner that I love from his book, Surrender to God. It's a great question to help you think about your sort of implicit model or view of God. Imagine God thinking about you. What do you assume God feels when you come to mind? So that's a little quick overview on the different types of attachment and how they operate. And again, in the research, they are categories, but they really operate as dimensions, so it's much more complex than that. But most of us do have one dominant attachment tendency, and so that can be helpful to understand how you tend to react, especially when you're distressed, and how this is playing out in your relationship with God. So given these ingrained attachment patterns, how do we promote deep, lasting, spiritual and emotional growth? This client, Jake, that I mentioned, put a lot of work into therapy, but during one period, he wasn't seeing any real change. He started to despair and he wanted to quit therapy. He would come in every week and he would say, "How long is this going to take, Doc?" And so I felt like I was talking him off the ledge. Like Jake, we all want to see immediate and clear results of our efforts to heal and grow. When we put 2 units of effort in, we want to get 2 units of growth out of it, and we want that to happen immediately, don't we? And when this doesn't happen, which is a lot of the time, it leaves us feeling helpless and frustrated. And even after we do see some initial growth, like Jake did, we eventually hit a wall in which these deeply ingrained patterns seem to pop up again and persist, even if they show up in different ways. Why does this happen? Why don't we see the growth and change we expect and maybe even feel that we deserve? And when this happens, how do we stay motivated to grow? What steps do we take to keep moving forward? To address these questions and struggles, the first step is to understand how deep growth works. First, we have to understand the overall goal, which is to change the implicit self, or our implicit relational knowledge of attachment filters. Second, we have to see the big picture that growth is not a straight path or a solo journey. It's a winding journey filled with curves, confusing roundabouts, and seeming dead ends. You just have to keep moving. And when the path twists and turns and you're not exactly sure where you're headed, you just keep moving. You have to keep engaging in spiritual practices and keep doing the internal work with the help of mentors, even when you don't see the results. And third, while difficult to see, incremental changes are important and build on each other until they coalesce into something qualitatively new. When this occurs, there is a transformation in the internal landscape of our soul. Our attachment filters reorganize, leading to a new experience of the self and new ways of relating. There may be long periods of time in which small incremental changes build on each other below the surface, and we're not able to clearly see them, like my client Jake, which can be discouraging. At certain points, however, one of those incremental changes will cause our attachment filters to shift or reorganize, leading to deep growth. This is what we might call a spiritual tipping point, the moment when deep change occurs and becomes visible. The tipping point is when a small input has a large and unpredictable effect. Tipping points are an example of what scientists call nonlinear or discontinuous change. I mentioned my client Jake earlier. He struggled a lot with anxiety and fear of abandonment. And at one point in therapy, as I mentioned, he wasn't seeing any clear, visible change, and he wanted to quit therapy. But he kept at it. He kept coming and working through painful issues, one session at a time. And we talked about many of the same issues over and over again. And then at a certain point, a tipping point occurred. It wasn't that he was completely healed, but an internal shift took place in his implicit self, which led to positive changes in all his relationships. You may have experienced this kind of internal shift in yourself or witnessed it in others. We move through our daily lives, and then in the midst of a deep connection, maybe unexpected, with a friend, a time of quiet prayer, or communal worship, something clicks, and the internal landscape of our soul shifts. It may be a seemingly small input, but it leads to a big change, deep growth that affects our core sense of self. How then do these transformational shifts in our attachment filters take place? And how do we intentionally promote this kind of growth? While relationships are the vehicle for change, they are somewhat out of our control. We can't control how others engage with us. However, there are some things that are in our control. We can do our part to facilitate the internal and relational processes that lead to deep growth. One of the key processes in deep change is the integration of two ways of knowing, which is facilitated by story. A key process in deep growth is bringing together two ways of knowing that I've alluded to: explicit knowledge or head knowledge and implicit relational knowledge, so that they work together in harmony. This is what I call the knowledge spiral. In this integrating back and forth process, we create and discover meaning through a story process. This happens in two ways, although in reality they are both part of one overall dynamic process of reorganizing or remixing our experiences and knowledge. In one dimension, we interpret our own experience through telling our story to ourselves and others. In another dimension, we feel an idea as we hear stories that work our explicit knowledge into our hearts. So, interpreting our experience. This involves linking our raw, gut-level knowledge, experience, and feelings with words and ideas. This is central to any growth process, and it's a core foundation of psychotherapy. An example is that comment I made to Jake, that it sounds like you feel like eventually everyone will leave you. This captured a baseline experience that he had had most of his life, but he had never put it into words. Jake was also able to capture his own experiences more precisely in his own words. For example, at one point, he told me, "I needed my dad's support as a child, but he let me down by making it unsafe to talk about our loss." This interpretive process enabled him to see the overall impact this had on his life, and to feel not just anger toward his dad, but also a new sense that it was okay to feel angry. This is part of how interpreting his previously inchoate experience changed the experience. It was now much more defined, and it led to a new overall experience of himself, that his feelings are okay, and that he is worth loving. This ultimately led to a growing forgiveness of his father and a new sense of security with God. The very act of narrating your experiences changes your perception of those experiences, allowing them to provide a loving connection that will bring growth and healing. The second way, the two ways of knowing come together to work in harmony through story, is when we feel an idea or feel God's truth. Through story, an idea or meaning becomes fused with our emotions and implicit knowledge, thus transforming it. So, how does story change us? It does so by conveying explicit knowledge in the implicit realm through the structure embedded within it. So this is Robert McKee. A quote from him where he says, "The exchange between artist and audience expresses idea directly through the senses and perceptions, intuition, and emotion," from his book called Story. Story doesn't explain its view of life, its explicit knowledge, in abstract ideas. Instead, it creates what McKee calls aesthetic emotion, the feeling of an idea. This is a more structured form of implicit knowledge, a knowing that exists in our emotions and experience, but that carries an idea within it. Aesthetic emotion is a very important concept because it exists at the borderline between implicit and explicit knowledge, coming very close to a fusion between the two. For example, in the movie The Martian Child, science fiction writer and widower David Gordon adopts an orphan boy named Dennis, who thinks he's from Mars. Throughout the film, the human experience of the story is dramatized, and we feel a profound idea about our own relationships. That loss profoundly hinders our ability to love. After a series of relational breakthroughs and setbacks between David and Dennis, Dennis finally runs away and climbs a tower to wait for his Martian people to come take him home. David finds him, climbs the tower, and reaches out to Dennis with an emotional plea. "Dennis, you're my son. You belong to me, and I will never, ever, ever, ever leave you." At that moment, Dennis faces a dilemma. He can continue to hope that the Martians will come take him home, or give up his defenses and take the risk of trusting David. As Dennis runs into David's arms, we immediately feel the controlling idea. Love overcomes loss when we face our fears and reach out to one another. The same principles apply to stories in Scripture and stories we might hear in our spiritual communities. Jesus taught truths through story to help us feel and experience them. The parable of the prodigal son is a well-known example. In this parable, we read about the son who squanders his inheritance and yet returns home and humbly seeks his father's forgiveness. "Father," he says, "I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son." When we read that the father was filled with love and compassion when he saw his son a long way off, and then threw a party to celebrate because his son who was dead has now returned to life, we feel the idea. God is infinitely gracious and delights when we seek to reconcile with him. Jesus' parables are designed to help us feel God's truth so that we know and inhabit them in a deeper way than just intellectually. Stories, then, help us to feel God's truth, to feel ideas so they sink down into our hearts and transform the implicit self. I want to close where we started. We are loved into loving. To find meaning and to grow spiritually, you must open yourself to be loved into loving. There is no other way. Being loved into loving by God and others, ultimately in the context of the church, is the only antidote to the social and spiritual disconnection that we are now experiencing at a societal level and in our individual lives. I want to end with this prayer that Paul prayed for the Ephesians, and this is my prayer for you. May your roots go down deep into the soil of God's marvelous love, and may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love really is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is so great you will never fully understand it. Thank you.